Coble, and I am the president of 350 Chicago, an affiliate chapter of 350.org. We are a climate justice organization dedicated to fighting the climate crisis. We are a nonpartisan, not-for-profit 501c3 organization seeking to inform Chicagoans, Illinoisans, and people across the country about the climate crisis. If you'd like to become involved, follow our activities, and/or volunteer with our organization, you can visit us at 350chicago.org. You can find news about all of our activities also on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. If you'd like to support our work, you can provide us with a generous donation. I have placed that link into the chat along with our website. We would greatly appreciate any support you can provide us so that we can do events like this. Tonight, we are proud to launch our monthly speaker series, and I would now like to introduce our Vice President and Communications Team Lead, Rich Foss, lead organizer of the speaker series. He will be introducing our inaugural speaker. Take it from here, Rich.
Okay, thanks, Larry. Thank you all for coming. Good evening. Like Larry said, my name is Rich Foss, and as we gather here today for this talk, we see that again, records in the United States, China, and across the world are being shattered due to climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has said in their sixth assessment report recently that we have less than 6.5 years before we face irreversible climate tipping points that will bring catastrophic changes to our already damaged climate, unless we act. The IPCC also says we still can avoid this outcome if the world can cut greenhouse gas emissions, especially carbon and methane, by 43% by 2030. Our speaker tonight, the inaugural speaker in our 350 Chicago's new monthly speaker series, is Bob Inglis, a former member of the House of Representatives from South Carolina. Bob Inglis won the 2015 John F. Kennedy Profiles and Courage Award for his work on climate change and is featured in the documentary Merchants of Doubt, a terrific documentary on misinformation, which everyone should see. Mr. Inglis founded the organization Republican, that's Republic and then capital E-N, so you guys can go Google it and check them out. Their organization is home to the Echo Right, and they promote addressing the climate crisis using free market principles. 350 Chicago is grateful to Mr. Inglis for his advocacy and sharing his ideas with us tonight. Brief question and answer period will follow Mr. Inglis' talk, so please submit any questions you have by clicking Q&A icon on your screen. Mr. Inglis, the floor is yours, sir.
Wow, thank you, Rich. Wonderful to be with you. Thank you, Larry, for doing this. It's great to have this opportunity to reach a whole bunch of folks that are joining us maybe from the convenience of their homes or whatever. So that's a great thing. Very low carbon footprint, I suppose, on this webinar, huh? So that's a good thing. Before I start, Rich just said there's going to be a Q&A time, but I want you to be thinking about a question that I want to ask you. And that is it possible to change what we tax in America? At least in part. Could we maybe untax some form of income and tax pollution instead? Be thinking about that for the Q&A time. So usually speakers let you ask the questions, but here I am saying, I'm asking the first question in the Q&A time, and I'm asking of you, do you think that's possible to entertain that kind of swap? So, having thrown out the first question that will come later, maybe I should first describe how I got to this, because Rich just described me as somebody that's all hepped up on climate, and that seems like it doesn't fit, right? I mean, Inglis is this conservative from South Carolina. Why is he talking about climate change? It's a liberal cause, right? So I need to establish why it was that I got so hepped up on climate. So I'll do that. And then what I thought I'd do is second, run through very quickly the policy options available to us as a nation and the world, really, to solve climate change. And then we'll, third thing, get to your questions and comments. How about that? So first, Inglis, how'd you get to this? Well, my first 6 years in Congress, I said climate change was nonsense. I didn't know anything about it except that Al Gore was for it. And in as much as I represented Greenville, Spartanburg, South Carolina in the US Congress, that was the end of the inquiry. Okay, I admit that's pretty ignorant, but that's the way it was my first 6 years in Congress. And, for those not familiar with South Carolina, we're a triangle, and there are 2 points on the ocean and then the one inland point. So Greenville, Spartanburg is in that inland point of South Carolina, very conservative place. And I fit the district for that first 6 years. Then I was out of Congress 6 years doing commercial real estate law, again in Greenville, South Carolina, and had the opportunity to run for the same seat again in 2004. That's the year that our son, the eldest of our 5 kids, had just turned 18, and he was voting for the first time. So he came to me and said, "Dad, I'll vote for you, but you're going to clean up your act on the environment." His 4 sisters agreed. His mother agreed. New constituency. And so that was step 1 of a 3-step metamorphosis. Step 2 was going to Antarctica and seeing the evidence in the ice core drillings. Went there with the science committee, House Science Committee. We can go into that in the Q&A time if you want to know about what that evidence is. And then the third step was another science committee trip and something of a spiritual awakening, which seems improbable, right, on a godless science committee trip, because we all know that all scientists are godless. Apparently not, because this Aussie climate scientist who was showing me the glories of the Great Barrier Reef as we snorkeled together, I could see was worshiping God in what he was showing me. St. Francis of Assisi supposedly said, I don't know if he actually said it, but supposedly St. Francis of Assisi said, "Preach the gospel at all times. If necessary, use words." And so Scott Heron, this Aussie climate scientist who's become a very dear friend, was doing just that. I mean, he's preaching the gospel in his just rejoicing and worshiping God in the creation that he was showing me. And so I knew we shared a worldview before any words were spoken. Later, with the snorkels out of our mouths, we had time to share some words. And so he told me about conservation changes he was making in his life to love God and love people who come after us. He rides his bike to work, does without air conditioning as much as possible in Townsville, Australia, a pretty hot place, hangs the family's clothes out on the line, all to consciously love people coming after us. So I got right inspired. I wanted to be like Scott, loving God and loving people. So I came home and introduced the Raise Wages, Cut Carbon Act of 2009. Note to self, do not introduce carbon tax in midst of Great Recession when you represent perhaps the reddest district of the reddest state of the nation. It will not go well. It didn't go well at all. After 12 years in office, I got 29% of the vote in a Republican runoff. The other guy got the other 71% of the vote. Rather spectacular faceplant in politics. You don't usually lose after 12 years by such a margin unless you've been indicted or something. And I hadn't been indicted. I was just on the wrong side of Tea Party orthodoxy. And truth be known, it wasn't simply climate change. That was my most enduring heresy, but there's other heresies too that I had committed. Let's see, I should confess all my sins here. Confession's good for the soul. I voted for TARP, the Troubled Asset Relief Program. That's President Bush's Rescue the Banks. Can't be forgiven by the Tea Party. That is a mortal sin. I was for comprehensive immigration reform, although we didn't call it that. I wrote an op-ed favoring gay marriage, which was not a very good political move, I suppose. But my most enduring heresy was just saying climate change is real. Let's do something about it. Because it appeared that I had crossed to the other side, that I was marching now with the Democrats, not with the Republicans anymore. And so that at that point, having been tossed out of Congress, a foundation came to me and said, Inglis, unusual zoo animal. actual conservative, 93 American Conservative Union rating, 100% Christian Coalition, 100% National Right to Life, A with the NRA, 0 the Americans for Democratic Action, that's a liberal group, 23 by some mistake with the AFL-CIO, the labor union. I was really hoping for a 0. I don't know how I got a 23. They said, actual conservative who says climate change is real. Will you speak and write for the proposition? That's what we're doing ever since. It's now this thing called republicen.org. It's EN for energy, entrepreneurship, the environment. It's an obvious misspelling of the word Republican. And we're out to convince conservatives to get in this conversation. So that's what I've known ever since. It's 4 of us and several contractors facilitating a community of about 20,000 online. If you're a conservative and you care about climate change, join us. It'll take you about 45 seconds. You just go to this site, republicen.org. The join button will follow you at whatever page you go to. And all it takes is 45 seconds. We just need your zip code and your email address. Email to stay in touch. We won't hound you for money because we've got some folks that help us with that. But we do want to know where you are, because that way we can make you visible to your member of Congress and to your 2 senators. And if you are a progressive, we want to be authentically conservative. So join us if you're a conservative or a right of center. But if you're left of center, share the website with somebody who you know to be right of center. And that'd be a great way for you to help us. So that's how I got to this. 3 steps. And by the way, if you've seen Merchants of Doubt, Robbie Kenner was not doing a film about the life and times of Bob Inglis in that film. So he collapsed that 3-step metamorphosis into 1 step. I gave him the long explanation I just gave you, and he shortened it up as he obviously had to. So that's the first thing I want to tell you about. Second thing I thought I'd do here is talk about the policy options available to us. And it's really 3 ways you can fix climate change. You can regulate emissions, you can incentivize clean energy, or you can price in the negative effects of burning fossil fuels into the price of products. One of those 3. So first one, you can regulate emissions. As you can imagine, this thing called republicen.org, we sort of break out in hives when you mention regulations. We get all itchy about that. But even if we weren't that way, isn't there a pretty obvious shortcoming of the regulatory approach, which is we can't regulate Chinese emissions from here in America. So we can only regulate our own emissions. Now, we could hope that the other countries of the world would follow our example, and maybe China would say, oh, aren't they good, morally upright people there in America? We think we'll do what they're doing. Not working that way on human rights. I don't know why I'd work that way on climate change. So we sort of aren't so big on that first option. Second option is to incentivize clean energy. This we are now doing through the Inflation Reduction Act in a big way. And I'm here to predict for you that it is going to work in a big way here in America, because those incentives are powerful. Most of them are basically tax credits. There are also some direct subsidies, but it's largely tax credits aimed at American taxpaying companies. So there's a challenge right there, isn't it? If you don't pay American taxes, you can't avail yourself of the American tax credits. So those credits, while very powerful for American firms, aren't available to Chinese firms. They don't change the economics for a Chinese firm. They really change the economics for an American firm. And those American firms are right now figuring out how to deploy a lot of wind and solar, and hopefully build some nuclear plants, and hopefully also build some hydrogen facilities. All those things get extra credits in the Inflation Reduction Act and are, as I say, very powerful credits. But if you're not getting China in, you're still not solving climate change. Because the devilish problem about climate change is emissions anywhere or climate change everywhere. And so you got to get the whole world in. Now, in fairness to these first two options, by the way, though, regulatory or the incentives, good things would come from both. We will clean up local air here in America. We'll have fewer asthma cases, fewer hospitalizations, longer life expectancy through a regulatory approach or through the clean energy incentives. Those things are going to work, and we're going to clean up local air. But if we're out to solve climate change, you got to get the world in on it. And so, having politely dissed, I suppose, option 1 and 2, you can tell I'm headed to option 3, which would involve a very difficult step, which is called a carbon tax. The better place to start that discussion, though, is to sort of go back to that question that I presaged for you and hope somebody will address in the Q&A time, is what if we change what we tax? Right now, we're taxing payroll, for example. There's somebody near you and me right now working a second or third job at McDonald's. She's paying 6.2% tax tonight on what it'll come out of her check. It'll be on the FICA box on her paycheck, 6.2% she's paying. What she doesn't see is that McDonald's Corporation is paying the other 6.2%. So it's a 12.4% tax on that second or third job that she's working tonight. It's a whoppingly regressive tax. In other words, regressive hurts poor people. If you have a high income, you place out of FICA taxes along about 125,000 or so. You don't pay any more FICA tax that year. But for this lady I'm positing at this McDonald's near you or me in her second or third job, she's paying 12.4% right on. So you reduce that tax. You put on a carbon tax. Let's say it's $30 per ton of CO2 emitted. You apply that at the mine and at the pipeline. Beauty of that administrative simplicity here is that there are less than 2,000 companies in America that either mine coal or that put stuff in pipelines to come to our gas stations and airports. So it's a very small job for the IRS to just tax those emissions at the mine, at the pipeline. So you put that tax on. Let's say it's $30 a ton. That's going to cause the price of gasoline for the lady working at McDonald's to go up by 30 cents a gallon. If it were $40 per ton price on carbon dioxide, it'd be 40 cents a gallon at the gas pump. It's basically that consistent. But $30 would result in 30 cents a gallon. Now her electricity bill is going to go up by $11 a month in the average home. So for her, that's a pretty big hit. If you're working a second or third job at McDonald's and you're paying 30 cents more per gallon, and you're paying $11 a month more in electricity, that's not good. That's clearly regressive. And the problem with the carbon tax by itself is it is regressive. It hurts poor people. But if you start this thing with a reduction in payroll taxes and then apply the carbon tax as part of the same deal, so it's an untaxed, really, untaxed income, put a tax on carbon dioxide instead. The Congressional Budget Office says the bottom 70% of Americans end up being better off. The only people who do worse have big houses and fly corporate jets and have heated pools in Chicago in the winter or whatever. Those are the people that pay more. And so it's pretty exciting, really, to have a solution that fits with the objective of getting emissions down, but also isn't regressive, doesn't hurt poor people. If you do this untax of income and then tax pollution instead. But here's the real kicker. The thing that is really so superior in this third option as opposed to number one, which again was regulatory, number two, which is clean energy incentives, is that this one does go worldwide. And here's why. The World Trade Organization would allow us to impose a carbon tax on countries' goods coming into our country if they don't have that same carbon tax in their country of origin. So take an example, a sheet of flat steel coming through the port of Seattle right now from China. They stole the technology, they manipulate their currency. Here it comes, the cheap steel. Okay, I'm a little bit sore about all those things, but here it comes, the cheap steel landed in Seattle. We apply our carbon tax. You can't do that, they say. That's an impermissible tariff. We think they're wrong. And that the World Trade Organization would rule in our favor, saying, no, you can have a content tax based on the content of stuff coming into your country, and this would be a carbon content tax. If we're right, and if it's upheld by the World Trade Organization, 24 hours later, so they do have an amazing way of reaching consensus in China. You know, they're not a very fair government, not a very nice government, doggone efficient though. 24 hours later, they'd have the same carbon tax as we have. Why? Well, they just paid in Seattle a carbon tax because of that border adjustment that they could have collected themselves. If they'd collected themselves, the tax money would be in Beijing, and the sheet of flat steel would come through the port of Seattle with no adjustment. So it's in their interest to follow our lead. Not because they're following our moral example, not because they think we're swell people. No, it's just a matter of who you want to have the tax money. You want to pay it, fork it over to the American government so they can pay for their stuff? Or do you want to collect it at home? In which case, goods go into that very attractive American market with no adjustment. So if you get China in, you got the whole world in, because if you're doing business anywhere in the world, you're doing business with America and China. And now 8 billion people start seeing the true cost of the burning of fossil fuels because it's built into the price of everything. And here's a hard political thing. This is hard. Vote Inglis for Congress. He wants to do this carbon tax, so the price of everything in your life goes up. Oh yeah, Inglis for Congress. Okay, that's not a good way to start, is it? Better to say, well, listen, we're going to cut your payroll taxes, and then we're going to do this carbon tax. But yes, indeed, the price of just about everything in your life goes up. So you go to the grocery store, and you're looking for plates for an event you've got. And there on the shelf, you'll find some paper plates and some plastic plates. Right now, they're sort of similarly priced, maybe. I think the plastic is maybe a little bit more expensive, probably. But you do this carbon tax and go back to the grocery store, the paper will go up in price a little bit because, they use chainsaws to chop down the pine trees in Georgia to make the paper, and they, use electricity and natural gas to make the paper. And so they'll have some added increment to their cost for their emissions. But then you look at the plastic plate, it's all petroleum all the time. And so it really gets walloped by the carbon tax. And so consumers go into the grocery store and say, well, now, what am I going to get? I got an event, I need some plates. Will I get these less expensive paper, or do I want these, whoa, those are expensive plastic plates? I think I'll get the paper. And it's not that it's going up artificially, it's going up to the actual cost those products are imposing on society. They're just now accountable for it, and they're attached to their product. And so then in the liberty of enlightened self-interest, did you see where Republicans were trying to reach out even to libertarians? In the liberty of enlightened self-interest, consumers pursue their self-interest and they buy those paper plates. And that happens on every shelf in the grocery store and at Walmart. The things that are renewable and have a lower carbon footprint appear relatively cheaper than dirty made accountable. No regulations doing that, no incentives, just simple accountability. But the question, so I told you tell you how I got to this, and then I told you these three policy options, and then I said we'd open up for questions and comments, and we can do that now. The hard part about what I've just described, though, is that question I asked right at the outset, is, could we change what we tax? And some people just say, no, it's not possible. It is not possible to change what we tax. I find that hard to believe. It would say to me that the experiment in self-government has failed, if that's the case. And maybe we should call up Charlie and ask him to come back. Say, King Charles, we're so sorry what happened back there in 1776. Why don't you come back and govern us? Because we can't govern ourselves. And why don't you decide what kind of taxes we should have? Because we need somebody over us. I'm not ready to make that call to King Charles. I think we can prove that, you know what, we really can govern ourselves and we can change what we tax. But that's my view. Let me see what you all think. Maybe you have a question or a comment about my question about whether we can change what we tax. Let me stop there and see what questions or comments you've got.
All right. Well, we've gotten a few here. I also have some that I wrote out earlier. Getting to that idea of a tax on carbon. A gentleman named Andy said, tax on carbon, yes. But what are the chances it could pass in Congress?
It's a hard slog, no doubt about it. It's like this. It's hard to explain. It took me looking at my clock, it probably took me 7 or 8 minutes of the 24 minutes or so that I took just then to explain that untax. That's the problem in politics. If you're explaining, you're losing. That's what all the political consultants say, So it does take some explaining. That is the hard part. But my hope is that we're getting to the place where we realize it's the most powerful thing to do. And in fact, if you ever have played the simulation that MIT has in a product called En-ROADS, E-N, separate word, roads, like roads and bridges. Looks like we're a wholly owned subsidiary with that EN. We're not. It's just that they saw the EN as a thing you could play with too, as energy and entrepreneurship, the environment. And so MIT has this thing called En-ROADS, and it's played as a simulation. You can actually have teams compete against each other. And I'll tell you how to win it if you ever get into the game. Choose a carbon tax first. You'll win. Because if you play the game, you see that it's the thing that most dramatically reduces emissions. And so, I did learn this from 12 years in Congress, that smart is hard, dumb is easy. You can tell people dumb stuff and they will stand on chairs and cheer for you. You tell them smart stuff and they look at you like you cock their heads and try to figure out where you're coming from, So it is hard. I admit it's politically hard, but I think it's like somebody said in the financial crisis of 2009, when the banks were going under, or October of 08. Somebody wrote, it's amazing how the impossible, the rescue of the banks, it's amazing how the impossible went to the inevitable without ever passing through the probable. I think that's what a carbon tax is. It is the impossible that will go to the inevitable without ever passing through probable. And it's because I think more and more Democrats will come to realize, hey, you know what? We did all this stuff in the Inflation Reduction Act. We got some great deployment of clean energy here in America, but it's not working elsewhere in the world. What are we going to do? And then there'll be Republicans that say, after a period of where we've gone off the rails and moving away from actual conservatism, that they'll come back to themselves, I hope, and say, you know what we really believe is just accountability. That's what we believe in. And yeah, if you're not going to grow government by giving me an equal tax cut, what's there not like about that? And so And the good news is, specifically, there are some members of the Senate and House that are talking these ways. Most notable probably is Mitt Romney, who has specifically talked about a carbon tax. But admittedly, though, it's hard. It's why we think organizations like ours and yours exist. And it's a very useful purpose you're serving, and we hope we're doing the same, is educating our constituencies about this third option. And if you do that, politicians will eventually follow. Politicians don't lead, they follow. Rare bird in politics, it actually leads. So we need to establish constituencies, and then they'll follow them there. So that a long answer, but I think it's coming. It's just admittedly hard.
So just one real quick follow-up. So this has been introduced a couple times, different iterations. One has been the fee and dividend. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, it's a great proposal. Full disclosure, I'm on the board of Citizens Climate Education, which is the 501c3 that supports Citizens Climate Lobby. And so that's their proposal. We think it's great. We're thick as thieves with CCL at republican.org. I was talking here about cutting payroll taxes as the revenue recycler. The CCL proposal is to return the money to the citizenry in a dividend check, similar to the Alaska Permanent Fund check. That makes a lot of sense. It also addresses regressivity. It's just so if I read tomorrow morning that had been adopted by the US Congress, I'd be a very happy fellow.
Okay, thanks. I have a question, Bob. I'm just curious, I know I understand that politicians can't always say exactly what they're thinking and feeling if they want to get votes. That's just part of the nature of the game. I'm just wondering, when you came out for action on climate change, did you get any private reactions from fellow congressmen or other GOP leaders that suggested they agree with you, or they are concerned about climate change as well, but didn't follow through politically?
Well, it's interesting. It's hard to remember this because it seems like Republicans have always been opposed to climate action. But you got to sort of force this back in your head, this history. Up until 2008, remember, I was in Congress 6 years, out 6, came back, started in 2004 for another 6. So from 2004 to 2008, I was in line with what was talked about in the Republican Party. Because of my son, because of the trip to Antarctica, because of being inspired by the faith of my friend Scott Herron, I was okay with what was the thought of the Republican Party. For example, Newt Gingrich in early 2008, was on the couch with Nancy Pelosi in an ad. If you Google Gingrich, Pelosi, and couch, you'll find the ad. We don't agree on much, do we, Newt? No, Nancy, but we agree that climate change is real. We need to do something about it. That's early 2008. By the end of 2008, Newt had switched. 2 things had happened. One is Chicago had sent a secret Muslim, non-American socialist to the White House. He's none of those things, but sadly, my party called Barack Obama all those names. And the second thing that happened was global financial crisis. October of 2008, the wheels are coming off the financial system. And Great Recession is starting. And people were very happy to hear from Newt as he switched-a-roo to the other side of, we don't know about climate change. They were glad to hear that from Newt because it took one worry bead off of the strand, a very long strand of worry beads. Is my house underwater? Is my job okay? It was a terrifying time. Is the bank going to fail? Is the entire banking system going to fail? Are we headed to some sort of dark ages? It was really seriously scary time. And so that began what we call the decade of disastrous disputation. People that that dispute climate change don't like to be called deniers because they say that equates them with Holocaust denial. So we give them the courtesy of calling them disputers. It's the decade of disastrous disputation. Started in 2008, ended in 2018. In 2018, my party, the Republican Party, lost control of the US House in suburban districts. And it dawned on Kevin McCarthy that he couldn't get the speakership and keep it without Republicans winning suburban districts. And you can't win a suburban district with a retro position on climate change. So there started Kevin, I think, thinking he's a long-term politician. He's thinking long-term. He'd like to be speaker, presumably, and it took him all these ballots to get there. But he got elected in 22. He'd probably like to be speaker in 24, 26, 28, 30, 32, long enough to die and have a building named for you. That's what speakers do, And so he's he's in it for the long term. The challenge right now is there's a particularly short-term thinker who wants to eke out one more victory in a presidential race, just one. And that guy has all of our people scared of him. And that's the current state of affairs in the Republican Party. So the long-term people, the people that are thinking, if you look at the polling data, young conservatives want action on climate change as much as young progressives do. And people like Kevin McCarthy, who hope to hold on to the speakership for a while, sees those demographics. He knows that wave is coming and he wants to be responsive. But meanwhile, he's got to get through this cycle until 2024 with that other guy who's thinking very, very short term and wants to stir up his base and say climate change is nonsense, et cetera, et cetera.
All right, I have a couple of just comments from people, and then we'll get to another question. So someone who's anonymous attendee says, yes, we can change what we tax when legislators see the money. And another one is single-use water bottles would be taxable. Yes, please. That's from Kate. I use money for water infrastructure. And then, someone said, Sarah said, my fear is that a carbon tax take too long to change behavior. Climate change is moving with a frightening pace. And another comment from Abigail, I think we can change what we tax because we used to mostly tax imports, if I'm remembering my history correctly. I guess the question that I have along that would be, that follows all that would be, let me find that one here. Let's see.
And while you're looking for that, let me just address that one part of those that's important to address is the speed at which a carbon tax would address things. That's what the MIT En-ROADS simulation will show you, is it's actually the fastest way to get to reductions. It basically takes the power of free enterprise and harnesses it to the climate solution, because it means that the paper plate manufacturers, wow, they go gangbusters. Anybody in that grocery store, anybody in that Walmart is looking for the things that don't bear a big carbon footprint. If they bear a big carbon footprint onto that shelf, their price is going up relative to some competitor that gets launched coming at them with a renewable product. And this is certainly something I learned on the science committee. We have all kinds of alternatives to the products we have now and the ways of making electricity we have now. It's just they're not economic. Because as long as you let fossil fuels get away with dumping for free into the trash dump of the sky without paying a tipping fee, well, they'll dump all day. And so you make them accountable, you put that on the price of their product. So now they got to show that on the shelf, basically, because they're paying the carbon tax. They got to pass it on to you, the consumer, else they go out of business. When they do that, that's when things really move quickly, because all kinds of startups come along and say, oh, we can beat you at that price. Now that you're made accountable for the dumping in the trash dump of the sky, you bet we can beat you.
So Sean, a gentleman named Sean says, is there any planned provision to redirect carbon taxes into energy efficient and renewable technologies, a carbon fund, so to speak?
Yeah, it's actually more popular than what I just described. If you do polling on this, Sean's proposal would be more popular than mine to cut payroll taxes, or to do the CCL approach, which is to return it to citizens. But I don't think that the position withstands shelling, especially from the right, because we have an experience with that. Out in Washington State, there was an attempt to do something like that. Jay Inslee wanted to create basically this fund. That's really hard for Republicans to swallow. That's just really difficult because it involves an appropriations process, and that seems like a good old boy network. That seems like people that know how to write the grants and get the money. That whole thing is not acceptable on the right. So if you want to bring along the right, what you have to do, the people right of center, is you have to say to them, I think, we're not going to grow government here. This is not a ruse to grow the government. We're not trying to plus up appropriations so we can spend more money from Washington. No. We're going to give the money right back to you. And so with it in your pocket, you decide, do you want to pay that gas guzzler that you've got? Or do you want to buy an EV? Well, you know what? If you buy the EV, you can pocket the change because now you're not paying the carbon tax so much. And what we count on is people who believe in the power of free enterprise and free people engaged in free enterprise, is they're going to want to pocket the money. They're going to want to save on energy so they can buy something else. They save on enough energy, they can take the kids to Disney World. And that's an incentive that people have, that they want to say, well, you know what, I can either keep on forking it out for all this fossil fuel stuff, or I can buy the cheaper stuff that's now made cheaper because it's renewable. And so we think that that's, again, why it's going to be so fast and why it's better than if you're going to try to get people right of center involved. That's a concession I think that the left needs to make, and to understand that you really can't convince people on the right that an appropriations process from Washington is a good thing. Probably not going to happen. Now, some people listening to me could say, well, let's forget the right. We don't need right of center. We can do this all on the left. To which I would say to you, well, good luck with that. Because what that means is we're involved in a 30-year process of decarbonization. And if you want to do it just on the left, you got to control the White House, the House, and the Senate, and a majority on the Supreme Court for 30 years. Good luck with that. It's not going to happen. The pendulum swings. And if you jam something through on one side of the aisle, like Obamacare, be certain that the other side, when the pendulum swings, will try to undo what it did, what was done. And so on this, I believe very strongly we've got to establish a bipartisan consensus and then stick to it. It's 30 years that we're doing this, and you can't be changing. Australia did a carbon tax, they undid it. They did it, they undid it. That didn't have a great impact in the world because Australia is a big and beautiful place, just not many people compared to a lot of other places in the world like the United States. But the United States, the biggest economy in the world, surely by per capita, cannot do that. We cannot do something like a major policy like carbon tax and then undo it, do it, undo it. We don't have time for that. We got to establish a policy and stick to it. And so that requires bipartisan cooperation. And that thing about that path, it reminds me, that it's a very low percentage shot to try to do it on one side or the other, just on the left, for example. And I realize that probably most people at 350.org would tend to be left to center. If you think you can do this totally on the left, I just ask you to really think through that, about whether it's a low percentage shot. So like me playing golf with my mother, who's a very good golfer, and I'd end up in the woods And she'd say, Bob, it's a chip shot out to the fairway, and then you're just one down. And I'd say, no, Mom, look right for those two trees. I can just get it right to there. Whack! I'd hit the tree and it'd come right back to where I was. She'd say, now you're two down, Bob. It's a chip shot out to the fairway, and then it's straight down the fairway. And so that's what I think of every time I hear somebody suggesting that, oh, no, we can do this only on the left. We can get it done. Yeah, right. 30 years. I don't think so. You got to find a Mitt Romney or 10 or 20. You got to find a John Curtis in the House or 30 or 40. Then you've got something going. Those are Republicans right there. I just mentioned John Curtis, a House member from Utah, and Mitt Romney, of course, Republican senator from Utah.
Yeah, I mean, amen to bipartisanship. And I think some of the best things that we have done in our country have come from people working together and with strong opinions, strong ideology, but of goodwill and agreeing on what the problem is. And I think once we agree what the problem is, hashing out the solutions, and probably it'll end up being, like the Constitution itself, right? It was a little of what you want, a little bit of what I want, and let's call it a day. I have a question from Joni. She asks, how have people in the business community reacted to the carbon tax proposal? Do they see the benefit? The cost of climate disasters is astronomical.
Yeah, it depends. And here's where I'll blow some minds here by saying that, for example, ExxonMobil is for what I've just described. They like a carbon tax. They don't want the regulatory approach. They don't believe really in the stick-to-itiveness of the incentives. They would go for a carbon tax. Now, in fairness, they probably wanted that to be a fairly low carbon tax, and that would be a fail as far as we're concerned. It needs to be a substantial carbon tax that's steadily rising. But the reason that ExxonMobil is for that, as explained to me by the lady that used to give me PAC checks from them, I said, Jeannie, if I were in front of an audience and somebody raised their hand and said, oh, ExxonMobil, when they talked about a carbon tax, they were just trying to kill cap and trade. That's the only reason that Rex Tillerson, when he was CEO of Exxon, ever raised it. I mean, I've heard that stated from audiences. And this lady that used to give me PAC checks is a straight shooting gal. And she set me straight. She said, Bob, we sell petroleum and natural gas here at ExxonMobil. If you put a carbon tax on, natural gas beats coal better than it's beating it now. That's why we're for a carbon tax. And I said, great, Jeannie, I can go tell conservatives you're just trying to make money. What else would be believable? I mean, so it's great that ExxonMobil, listen, if you can sell lots of natural gas, which is a bridge fuel, I can tell you, it's not going to be around forever, I don't think, as a fuel. But in the meantime, it emits 50% less CO2 than coal when it's burned to make electricity. We do have the problem of fugitive emissions, and that is a big problem, probably susceptible to a regulatory solution, actually. Although in the Inflation Reduction Act, there's a price on methane, which is interesting, that it's sort of like the first testing of this kind of price thing. But it's like this, if you're ExxonMobil and you can make electricity for me with 50% less CO2 than the coal, good on you while it lasts. Probably not going to last forever for you because, something's going to replace it. So yeah, there's some companies that are unlikely folks that are for it. Meanwhile, Marathon of Ohio, violently opposed, apparently, because all they have is petroleum. They don't have any natural gas. And so all they sell is gas and chips and soda. And so they're very opposed. And so I guess, Rich, what I'd say is it depends where you sit determines where you stand in politics. And in business, it's where your portfolio is invested is where you stand.
All right. Another person who's anonymous attendee has this question, and it sort of it will sort of catapult on along a question I sort of thought about earlier, which is, so he asks, in our current society, we typically live in political bubbles. Do you recommend any ways of bringing those bubbles together and ways to bring up climate change issues to people who are across the aisle. And this is, I will catapult off of that, which is, build off that. How would you suggest I start a conversation with my conservative friends and relatives about climate change and what to do about it?
Such a great question. And the answer is to say to them, we need you. Just be very vulnerable and say, we really need you. We can't do it ourselves. That vulnerability will open the conversation, open some hearts, and hearts are what decide and the head justifies. So if you can get in the heart by being vulnerable enough to say, hey, you know what? I'm left of center, but we can't do this on our own. We got to have you. So Uncle Charlie or Cousin Sam or whoever you're talking to, we got to have you. And that's not what Sam and Charlie are hearing right now. And it's maybe hard for some people to realize what Charlie and Sam are hearing. What they're hearing, especially if they're like old white guys, is, you know what? We don't need you anymore. You're just like a barnacle on the ship of state. We're going to move on without you. We're going to get this next sandbar. We're going to rub you off. That's sort of what Charlie and Sam are hearing. And so if they heard from you, oh no, we need you, Sam. We need you, Charlie. Even if it's like a retired petroleum engineer, hey, he's an old white guy. He's got white hair and he's worked in petroleum all his life. We need you. You know why? We got to figure out a way to store some CO2, and you know an awful lot about drilling. So how about help us find out where we're going to stick this stuff? Now, he's feeling affirmed and feeling like, oh, there's a place for me in this new world. They're not trying to cancel me. And that's really what's, in a way, it's hard to understand that, right? Because if you're on the left, you're probably thinking, nobody's trying to cancel them. Nobody's trying to get rid of them. What is Inglis talking about here? Just think about that's what they've heard, though. They heard that, or they felt it somehow. Because it's been put to me very succinctly this way, and I think it's really true. You have cultural power and you have political power. And in this country, at this point, Democrats have cultural power. They wish to add to that political power. Republicans have political power in the way the Electoral College is set up and the way that the Senate is set up. They seek to add to that cultural power. And so the thing is, as a Republican, I would tell you, if I were wagering, I'd wager on cultural power because it's longer term. It's got staying power as opposed to political power. And so the big fight right now is about holding on to that political power because there's a fear that cultural power is going to take us places where particularly where conservatives don't want to go. And so that's the challenge, right? Is figuring out some way to say to Sam and Charlie, no, we like you. We want you. You're part of us. We're come on, we can get this, we can get together and win together.
Okay, so I agree with that, by the way. I know a lot of Sam's and Charlie's. So this is a great question, and this ties in with our next speaker next month, who will speak on this topic. But I think this is partly why a lot of people don't come to webinars on climate change, don't want to talk about it at the family barbecue or and I certainly can understand this. It is really hard. Really hard facts to face. It's really troubling and disturbing, especially when you think about our children and our grandchildren. So I can totally sympathize with folks, coming home from work and just wanting to turn on Netflix and not think about that or think about other issues that maybe are less daunting. But this question is, do you ever feel hopeless in the face of accelerating climate change? If so, where do you find energy to continue your work?
Yeah, it can be real discouraging. I mean, it can be very discouraging. So I first want to acknowledge that. You know, I will tell you this, though. I am confident that we're going to win, that we are going to act on climate change. And I think we're going to act in a powerful way. And I think it's going to be through this mechanism of accountability, the inevitable that passes, that becomes inevitable, even though it never passed through probable. Meanwhile, though, the scientists are ringing in my ears saying, faster, Inglis, faster. We don't have time for demographic change. We don't have time for those young conservatives to come of age. We got to do this faster. Okay, so I feel that all the time. But I get discouraged at times. I will tell you what I do when I get discouraged. Maybe you'll want to do this. I go and watched John F. Kennedy making the moonshot speech at Rice University in September of 1962. It's 17 minutes of pure American exceptionalism, better than any Republican's ever done it. You know, President Kennedy admits in that speech that some of the materials needed for the spacecraft hadn't been invented yet. No matter, we're going to the moon before the decade is out. And what I think he was showing was just amazing confidence in the American people. And you know, I tell you, I watch it all the time. If you go see the JFK Library and you see how many views, I'm about half of them, and I cry every time, because it's just an amazing speech of just commitment and determination. And you could say, oh, well, that was easy for him back then. The country was all together. What? The country was together? No, he had Southern governors out and out defying federal orders of integration. He had, you know, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let's see, that was September 62. That's 61, right? Anyway, he was just over that. The Cuban Missile Crisis. I mean, no, it wasn't easy times for JFK at that point. But America came together and got it done. You know, and just one thing, I realized we were close to time here, but I got to tell you this. I was on the science committee, as I mentioned, and the flight surgeon for that Apollo mission that landed on the moon in 1969 came by one day. And I asked him in the hallway of the science committee offices, I said, is it true you didn't know the depth of the moon dust? He grabbed me by the arm and took me aside. He said, it's so true. We had no idea the depth of the moon dust. He said, those were my patients. I was monitoring their heartbeats. He said, it was quite possible that they were going to fly to their graves with the whole world watching. But as God would have it, the thrusters came on, blew away a little bit of dust, the eagle landed. And that's just incredible. I mean, we look back and we say, oh, sure, we went to the moon. No, it was an incredible feat. And so this thing of solving climate change, it is an incredible feat. But I believe we're going to do it. And I keep on saying one last thing, but I always say there's one last thing too. If you're a progressive, and all these things I've just described, they're all read here in republican.org. And if you go to our site, it's all read, and share it with some conservative friend of yours. If it sounds familiar as a solution that I just described, that third thing, it's like this. It's the same thing that Al Gore has been for about 30 years. I asked him a couple of years ago if I could keep on saying that. He said, well, hold up, Bob. If you're talking a low, I said, no, sir, I'm talking a substantial carbon tax that's steadily rising. He said, yeah, fine then. Yes, you can tell people that what you're for is what I've been for about 30 years. And so I have this hope that if people like Art Laffer, who you'll see on our site, Reagan's advisor, who's actually a literal neighbor of Al Gore's in Nashville, Tennessee, is for what we're for, as you'll see in our website. And so that's pretty far right. And then you have Al Gore left to center. If we can bring those two folks together, maybe we can bring America together and lead the world to solutions. And so that's my hope. And I think we're going to get there. It's just, it is a scary time though, when, smoke and water are coming up, and wow, it's a scary time.
Bob, I know you have to move on, but I want to Kate has one quick question. I think it's a yes or no answer. She asks, will you be running for president next year? She says, please.
Yeah, of the Rotary Club. If I join the Rotary Club and I don't show up for the meeting, then I will be running as president, right? You get elected as president when you don't show up to the meeting. So, but thank you, Kate, for the inherent compliment there. But no, apparently you have to have a screw loose to run for president. But I got some screws loose, but maybe not enough to think that I am. Yeah, I think I should be the leader of the free world. Yeah, I think I probably should be. So that's apparently what happens to people when they run for president. They decide they should be the leaders of the free world.
Before we close, I just want to say, I want to thank everybody for attending. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but Rich, if you want to pick up from here.
Yeah, thank you. Bob, that was terrific. I wish I could have you in my pocket, and every time I'm fumbling my way trying to discuss climate change with Republicans and conservatives, I could bring you out and you could say it as eloquently as you have here. So I'd like to end with a quote. You talked about one president, Bob, and I'd just like to quote another one. And this is the quote: "In our obsession with antagonisms of the moment, we often forget how much unites all the members of humanity. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world." That was Ronald Reagan speaking to the United Nations in 1987. And I think probably anybody else speaking wouldn't be able to get away with a line like that, talking about an alien invasion, other than Ronald Reagan. So I just bring that up because the threat we face today is not external, but it is a universal common threat of all human beings, and it's of our own making. We need to take action, and 350 Chicago urges everybody listening to take action. Learn the science, talk to others about what you learn. Join us here at 350 Chicago. We'd love to have you. We'd love to have liberals, conservatives, political novices, whatever. It doesn't matter. I agree with Bob that we all have to work together. And we have these incentives that Bob mentioned from the IRA that are coming down the pike. And will be administered by each state's government, and they will make it affordable to get solar panels or get electric car or get an electric dryer. And if we all just did something, we could really help turn this around. So I'd like to thank you, Bob, Mr. Inglis, your associate Price, and the 350 Chicago Communications Team Committee for all their work on this event. And I'd just like to say, I mentioned this earlier, but our next speaker for our monthly speaker series is Marilee Feldman, who is a psychologist who will speak in Chicago at Adler University on August 24th. You can see more information about this and other upcoming speakers we have about geothermal energy and other topics, and of course on our social media. Okay, Larry, would you like to close things out?
Yeah, that was great. Bob, thank you again. Very appreciative of you giving us of your time to be here tonight and to answer lots of questions and speak eloquently about your experience and of what your ideas are and what Republican.org, the work you were doing there. And I would like to I just lost my closing remarks. So I would like to thank Rich Foss and the communications team for creating the speaker series and inviting former Congressman Bob Inglis to be our first presenter. If you'd like to support 350 Chicago's work, you can provide us with a generous donation again. You can go to 350chicago.org. There's a donate button there. There's also in the chat. If you'd like to become more involved or follow our activities and or volunteer with our organization, again, 350chicago.org. You can also find us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. And I want to thank everybody who attended and signed up and attended tonight. We're so appreciative of your interest in this event and willing to give us an hour for this. So I want to thank you all for coming to our webinar, and thank you and good night. Thank you again, Bob.
Thanks so much. See ya.